Picture yourself at a medieval royal wedding, where the glittering feast hides poisoned wine, whispered vows mask deadly betrayals, and every guest could be an assassin waiting to strike. These aren't scenes from a grim fantasy. They're the shocking truth of royal nuptials in the Middle Ages, where love was a myth and danger was the guest of honor. Today, we'll unravel 6 dark tales of these treacherous ceremonies, from murderous banquets to vows forced on children, all backed by chilling historical records. If these stories leave you stunned, smash that like button, subscribe for more medieval madness, drop a comment with the wedding that shocked you most, and hit the bell to never miss a tale. Let's dive into the chaos. Medieval royal weddings were spectacles of opulence, with sprawling banquets that showcased a dynasty's wealth and power. Golden goblets overflowed with wine, tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, and minstrels filled the air with music. But beneath the grandeur lurked a sinister reality. These feasts were often deadly traps, where poison could turn celebration into catastrophe. In an era where political rivalries simmered and enemies mingled with allies, a single sip from a tainted chalice could silence a king, ruin an alliance, or eliminate an inconvenient heir. Far from the romantic fairy tales we imagine, these wedding banquets were high-stakes battlegrounds where guests ate with one eye on their plate and the other on their neighbor. This segment delves into the chilling prevalence of poisoned feasts. At royal weddings, the methods and motives behind these lethal acts, the historical examples that shocked medieval courts, and the pervasive fear that made every bite a gamble, revealing why you'd think twice before raising a glass at these treacherous affairs. Poison was a favored weapon in the medieval arsenal, subtle yet devastating in a world without forensic science or antidotes. Its use at royal weddings was not mere paranoia, but a documented threat, as chroniclers recorded sudden illnesses, mysterious deaths, and whispered accusations at these lavish events. The motives were as varied as the poisons themselves. Arsenic, belladonna or hemlock could be slipped into wine or food to settle old scores, disrupt alliances, or clear succession paths. Weddings, with their crowded halls and distracted guests, were perfect stages for such treachery. The chaos of a feast, with servants bustling and goblets passed freely, allowed poisoners to strike undetected, leaving victims to collapse amidst the revelry. The fear of poison was so acute that some royals employed tasters, though even these precautions weren't foolproof. The stakes were highest at royal weddings, where rival factions gathered under the guise of celebration, each plotting to shift the balance of power. A prime example is the 1152 wedding of Louis VII of France to Constance of Castile, a union meant to strengthen ties with the powerful Castilian dynasty. The lavish banquet in Paris was a display of Capetian might, but whispers of poisoning attempts cast a dark shadow. Chroniclers like Robert of Torigny noted that several guests fell ill after the feast, with rumors pointing to Louis's enemies, possibly disgruntled nobles opposed to the alliance. While no definitive proof emerged, the incident fueled paranoia, as attendees realized that even the king's table was no safe haven. Louis himself, wary of such plots, reportedly relied on trusted servants to taste his food, a practice that became common among wary monarchs. The fear wasn't baseless. Medieval courts were rife with factions, and a wedding uniting two powers often provoked those left out of the deal. Another chilling case occurred at the 1285 wedding of Alexander III of Scotland to Yolande of Dreux. The Scottish king, widowed and seeking a new heir, hosted a grand feast in Jedburgh to cement the marriage. Yet, the celebration was marred by unease, as chroniclers like the Lanercost Chronicle reported sudden illnesses among guests, with some attributing them to poisoned wine. Alexander's own death a year later in a riding accident fueled speculation that the wedding feast was a testing ground for toxins, though no direct evidence confirms this. The timing was suspicious, as his marriage threatened English interests, particularly Edward the Fern's ambitions over Scotland. Guests at the banquet, aware of these tensions, would have eaten cautiously, knowing that a single sip could be their last. The methods of poisoning were as cunning as they were varied. Poisons could be concealed in wine, a favorite medium due to its strong flavor and communal serving, making it easy to target a specific victim or an entire table. Food, too, was vulnerable. Spices, a luxury at royal feasts, could mask the bitter taste of arsenic or aconite. Servants, often bribed or coerced, were key players in these plots, slipping toxins into dishes during the chaos of service. The 12th century chronicler, Gerald of Wales, described a wedding feast where a noble's cupbearer was bribed to poison a rival, only for the plot to be uncovered when the taster collapsed. Such incidents, though rare in surviving records, highlight the constant threat that loomed over every banquet table. The psychological toll of this fear was immense. Guests at royal weddings, from kings to minor lords, dined in a state of hypervigilance, knowing that a rival might seize the moment to strike. The 1308 wedding of Isabella of France to Edward II of England, intended to seal peace between England and France, was a tense affair. French and English nobles, wary of each other's intentions, eyed the feast warily, with some refusing dishes offered by their hosts. Chroniclers noted the presence of tasters for both bride and groom, a precaution that spoke volumes about the lack of trust. The marriage itself, though successful in producing an heir, was overshadowed by this atmosphere of suspicion, with every clink of goblets a potential prelude to disaster. Poison wasn't the only danger at these feasts. The sheer scale of medieval banquets, often lasting hours with dozens of courses, created opportunities for other forms of sabotage. Drunken brawls, sparked by political rivalries, could erupt, turning celebrations into chaos. At the 1268 wedding of Eric II of Norway to Margaret of Scotland, a feast meant to unite the two realms saw tensions flare between Scottish and Norwegian nobles, with one account suggesting a near riot over disputed toasts. While no poison was confirmed, the incident shows how wedding feasts were powder kegs, where a single spark could ignite violence or worse. The motives behind poisoning were deeply tied to the political stakes of royal weddings. These events were not just celebrations, but diplomatic chess moves, forging or breaking alliances that could reshape kingdoms. A well-timed poisoning could derail a treaty, eliminate a rival heir, or weaken a dynasty. For instance, the 1191 wedding of Berengaria of Navarre to Richard II of England, held in Cyprus during the Third Crusade, was fraught with tension. Rival factions, including those loyal to Philip II of France, saw the marriage as a threat to French influence, and rumours swirled of attempts to sabotage the feast. While Richard survived, the fear of poison lingered, with his chroniclers noting his insistence on trusted cooks and servers. The vulnerability of young royals at these events was particularly acute. Child brides and grooms, often central to the wedding's political purpose, were easy targets. The 1396 wedding of 7-year-old Isabella of France to Richard II of England saw the young bride surrounded by English nobles, some of whom opposed the French alliance. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart noted the tense atmosphere, with fears that the banquet could be used to target the child or her entourage. Isabella, though spared, lived in a court where such threats were ever present, her youth offering no protection. The church, a powerful presence at royal weddings, did little to curb these dangers. While it oversaw the sanctity of vows, it turned a blind eye to the undercurrents of treachery, often benefiting from the political fallout. Papal dispensations for consanguineous marriages, common at these events, kept power within elite circles, but did nothing to ensure the safety of the feast. The church's own agents could be complicit, as seen in rumours surrounding the 1215 wedding of John of England's daughter to Hugh X of Lusignan, where ecclesiastical rivals allegedly stirred discord to weaken the alliance. The aftermath of these poisoned feasts often reshaped history. A single death could unravel years of diplomacy, as seen in the ripple effects of Alexander III's wedding and subsequent death, which plunged Scotland into a succession crisis. The fear of poison also changed courtly behaviour, with monarchs, like Edward the Fine, employing elaborate precautions, including sealed wine casks and loyal tasters, at his daughters' weddings. Yet no precaution was infallible, and the spectre of poison haunted every royal gathering. For guests, attending a royal wedding was a gamble with life and death. The lavish spread, venison, swan, and spiced wine, was a feast for the senses, but also a potential funeral. The psychological strain of dining in such an environment, where a rival's smile could hide a deadly intent, turned celebration into survival. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris described the unease at such events, where laughter mingled with suspicion. The legacy of these poisoned feasts is a stark reminder that medieval royal weddings were not about love, but power, where every toast could be a death sentence. As we move to the next segment on political traps and betrayals, consider this. If the banquet table was a battlefield, the wedding itself was a chessboard where every move could lead to checkmate or catastrophe. Medieval royal weddings were more than glittering ceremonies. They were high-stakes arenas where alliances were forged and betrayals were plotted under the guise of celebration. Far from romantic unions, these events were diplomatic chess matches, where guests, nobles, rivals, and foreign envoys gathered with hidden agendas. The banquet halls, draped in silks and lit by torchlight, buzzed with whispered conspiracies as attendees sought to undermine the marriage, seize power, or trap unsuspecting enemies. A single misstep could spark a coup, unravel a treaty, or cost a king his crown. This segment uncovers the treacherous political traps and betrayals that turned royal weddings into dangerous gambits, exploring the motives, the schemes, and the historical examples that reveal how these joyous occasions became stages for deception, leaving guests and newlyweds alike navigating a web of intrigue where trust was a luxury none could afford. Royal weddings were prime opportunities for political maneuvering because they drew together rival factions under one roof. These events were designed to cement alliances or end wars, but they also exposed vulnerabilities. A marriage uniting two kingdoms often provoked resentment among those excluded from the new power dynamic, making the wedding a perfect moment for sabotage. Nobles, ambitious for influence, might exploit the chaos of festivities to sow discord, while foreign powers sent spies disguised as diplomats to gather intelligence or destabilize the event. The stakes were astronomical. A failed alliance could plunge kingdoms into war, and a well-timed betrayal could shift the balance of power overnight. Guests arrived armed with charm and daggers, both literal and figurative, knowing that a wedding could be as much a trap as a celebration. One chilling example is the 1396 wedding of Richard II of England to 7-year-old Isabella of France, a union meant to seal a truce between England and France during the 100 Years' War. The lavish ceremony in Calais was a spectacle of diplomacy, with French and English nobles mingling uneasily. Yet beneath the surface, Richard's enemies were plotting. The marriage, intended to secure peace, angered English lords like the Duke of Gloucester, who saw it as a sign of Richard's weakness. Chronicler Jean Froissart noted whispered conspiracies during the feasts, with some nobles using the event to rally support for Richard's eventual deposition in 1399. The wedding, meant to unite, became a stage for plotting, with Richard's young bride unknowingly at the centre of a brewing storm. Another notorious case was the 1215 wedding of John of England's daughter, Joan, to Hugh X of Lusignan, a strategic move to pacify rebellious French nobles. The ceremony, held in Poitiers, was fraught with tension as John's allies and enemies mingled. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris recorded that some French lords, resentful of English influence, used the wedding to forge secret pacts against John, laying the groundwork for rebellions that weakened his reign. The banquet hall became a whispering gallery, where toasts masked plans to betray the English crown. Such betrayals were not just opportunistic, but calculated, exploiting the wedding's role as a diplomatic fulcrum to shift power. The mechanics of these traps were as varied as the motives. Weddings offered cover for espionage, as guests could move freely, eavesdropping or planting rumors to destabilize alliances. Some nobles arrived with forged documents or false pledges, aiming to manipulate negotiations held during the festivities. Others used the occasion to intimidate weaker rivals, pressuring them into unfavorable agreements. The 1308 wedding of Isabella of France to Edward II of England saw French envoys, ostensibly there to celebrate, gathering intelligence on Edward's court, which later aided French strategies against England. The crowded halls filled with music and wine allowed conspirators to blend in, their whispers lost in the din. Betrayals often targeted the newlyweds themselves, especially when they were young and vulnerable. Child brides and grooms, central to the wedding's political purpose, were easy prey for manipulators. The 1200 marriage of 12-year-old Blanche of Castile to Louis VIII of France, sealed by the Treaty of Le Goulet, was meant to secure peace between England and France. Yet, French nobles hostile to the English alliance used the wedding to spread rumors about Blanche's legitimacy, hoping to undermine the treaty. Blanche, a pawn in her grandmother Eleanor of Aquitaine's diplomacy, faced a court where her every move was scrutinized, her youth making her a target for betrayal. The psychological toll on attendees was immense. Guests, from kings to minor lords, arrived knowing they might be walking into a trap. The 1268 wedding of Eric II of Norway to Margaret of Scotland was meant to unite two northern powers. But the feast saw near violence as Scottish and Norwegian nobles clashed over precedents and past grievances. Chroniclers noted the uneasy peace at the tables, with guests wary of every gesture. This atmosphere of distrust turned celebration into a test of survival, where a misplaced word could spark a feud or signal a plot. Even the hosts weren't immune. Monarchs like Edward V, hosting his daughter's weddings, employed spies to monitor guests as pipe rolls record payments for watchers at such events. Some betrayals had catastrophic consequences, reshaping kingdoms. The 1191 wedding of Richard I of England to Berengaria of Navarre, held in Cyprus during the Third Crusade, was a diplomatic triumph but provoked Philip II of France, who felt sidelined. Philip's envoys, present at the feast, used the occasion to rally allies against Richard, contributing to tensions that later saw Richard imprisoned on his return from the crusade. The wedding, meant to secure Navarre's support, instead sowed seeds of betrayal that cost Richard his freedom. Similarly, the 1285 wedding of Alexander III of Scotland to Yolande of Dreux, already tainted by poisoning rumours, saw English envoys quietly negotiating with discontented Scottish lords, laying groundwork for Edward I's later claims over Scotland. The Church, a key player in these weddings, often turned a blind eye to the intrigue, focusing on the sanctity of the ceremony while ignoring the political machinations. Bishops and abbots, present to bless the union, sometimes had their own agendas, using weddings to secure ecclesiastical influence. At the 1215 Lusignan wedding, church officials reportedly mediated disputes, but also brokered secret deals with French nobles, undermining John's authority. The church's complicity added another layer of betrayal, as spiritual guidance became just another tool in the power game. Young royals, often the centerpiece of these weddings, were particularly vulnerable to betrayal. The 1180 wedding of 8-year-old Agnes of France to Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos was a diplomatic coup, but it left Agnes exposed in a foreign court. When Alexios was murdered in 1183, the 12-year-old bride was married to his killer, Andronikos I, a betrayal orchestrated by Byzantine nobles exploiting her youth. Her wedding, meant to forge ties, became a trap that ensnared her in a cycle of political upheaval. The fallout from these betrayals could linger for generations. The 1396 Richard-Isabella marriage, while temporarily easing Anglo-French tensions, fueled domestic unrest that led to Richard's downfall, with nobles emboldened by their wedding conspiracies. Similarly, the 1200 Blanche-Louis marriage, though successful in producing heirs, sowed distrust that resurfaced in later Anglo-French conflicts. These weddings, far from uniting, often deepened divisions as betrayed parties sought revenge in subsequent wars or rebellions. For attendees, surviving a royal wedding required cunning and caution. Nobles arrived armed with knowledge of their rivals' motives, while monarchs deployed guards and informants to thwart plots. The pipe rolls of Henry III note expenses for keepers at his sister's wedding, a stark reminder that even the host feared betrayal. The psychological strain was palpable as guests navigated a labyrinth of smiles and subterfuge, knowing a single misstep could cost them their lives or their legacy. In essence, the political traps and betrayals at medieval royal weddings turned these joyous occasions into perilous gambles. Every toast, every dance, every whispered conversation carried the weight of potential treachery. As we move to the next segment on shocking vows and forced unions, consider this. If the banquet was a battlefield, the vows themselves were a contract signed in fear, binding young royals to fates they could neither choose nor escape. Medieval royal weddings were far from the romantic spectacles of fairy tales. They were cold, calculated transactions, where vows were often extracted under duress, binding unwilling participants, sometimes mere children, to strangers for the sake of power. These ceremonies, draped in velvet and blessed by the church, masked a grim reality. Brides and grooms, especially the young, had little say in their fates, their words of commitment coerced by family, politics, or threats. The altar was less a place of love and more a stage for dynastic deals, where shocking vows could lead to betrayal, imprisonment, or lifelong misery. This segment explores the harrowing practice of forced unions at royal weddings, the emotional and physical toll on those who spoke the vows, the political machinations behind them, and historical examples that reveal how these ceremonies turned sacred promises into shackles, making the wedding day a moment of dread rather than joy. In the medieval world, marriage was a cornerstone of diplomacy, designed to forge alliances, secure peace, or claim territories. Royal children, often betrothed in infancy, were raised knowing their weddings would serve the crown, not their hearts. The church set minimum marriage ages at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but betrothals could occur earlier, with vows, formalized later under intense pressure. These vows were binding, backed by treaties, dowries, or military pacts, making refusal tantamount to treason. For young royals, the act of saying "I do" was a public performance, often rehearsed and enforced by parents or guardians, leaving no room for dissent. The psychological strain of pledging lifelong commitment to a stranger, sometimes decades older, was immense, yet their feelings were irrelevant in the face of political necessity. A heart-wrenching example is the 1193 marriage of Ingeborg of Denmark to Philip II of France. At 18, Ingeborg was wed to secure Danish support, but the day after the ceremony, Philip rejected her, claiming non-consummation to seek an annulment. Ingeborg, forced to recite vows under diplomatic pressure, was humiliated and imprisoned for years when she refused to accept the annulment, her letters to the Pope revealing her despair. Her wedding, meant to unite kingdoms, became a trap, her vows a chain that bound her to a husband who despised her. This shocking rejection, played out before a stunned court, underscores the powerlessness of royal brides in the face of coerced promises. Child brides faced even greater horrors. There, youth exploited to seal alliances. The 1396 wedding of 7-year-old Isabella of France to Richard II of England, aged 29, was a diplomatic move to end hostilities in the 100 Years' War. Isabella, barely old enough to understand the vows she recited, was paraded. As a symbol of peace, her childhood sacrifice to politics. Chronicler Jean Froissart noted the unease among guests, aware of the stark age gap and the political fragility of the union. Isabella's vows, spoken in a language she was still learning, tied her to a foreign court where she faced isolation and scrutiny, her youth no shield against the weight of expectation. The mechanisms of coercion were ruthless. Royal children were groomed from a young age to accept their roles as diplomatic pawns, with tutors and parents drilling obedience into them. Refusal could mean disgrace, imprisonment, or worse. Joan of Kent, a 12-year-old heiress, defied her guardians by secretly marrying Thomas Holland in 1340, but only after immense pressure to wed another for political gain. Her clandestine act required papal intervention to legitimize, showing the risks of resisting forced vows. Most lacked Joan's courage or opportunity, reciting their lines under the watchful eyes of family and court, knowing defiance could unravel alliances or spark wars. The emotional toll of these forced unions was devastating. Young brides, like Margaret of Anjou, wed at 15 to Henry VI of England in 1445, faced hostile courts where their vows tied them to unstable regimes. Margaret's marriage, meant to secure peace, thrust her into the Wars of the Roses, where her youth made her a target for accusations of overreach. Chroniclers noted her fierce spirit, but this was likely a defense against the pressure of vows that bound her to a weak king and a fractious court. Boys, too, suffered. Louis VIII of France, betrothed at 12 to Blanche of Castile in 1200, recited vows under his father's orders to seal the Treaty of Le Goulet, his childhood autonomy stripped away. The political motives behind these vows were unrelenting. Kings like Edward IV of England used their daughters, Eleanor, Joan, and Margaret, as bargaining chips to secure borderlands or neutralize rivals. Eleanor, wed at 14 to Alfonso III of Aragon, was forced to negotiate her husband's ransom. After his capture, a task tied to the vows she spoke under duress. These marriages often required relocation to foreign courts, amplifying the sense of alienation. Anna of Kiev, married to Henry I of France in 1051, travelled from Rus never to return, her vows binding her to a life of cultural isolation. The Church, meant to sanctify these unions, often facilitated the coercion. Papal dispensations allowed consanguineous marriages, common among royals, to keep power within elite circles, but they ignored the human cost. Bishops presiding over weddings, like that of Ingeborg and Philip, turned a blind eye to the bride's distress, prioritizing political stability over her well-being. The Church's complicity ensured that vows, however forced, were legally binding, trapping young royals in unions they couldn't escape without risking excommunication or war. The physical risks of these forced unions were also significant, especially for young brides. Early consummation, though officially forbidden before puberty, was sometimes pressured to secure heirs, leading to health complications. Isabella of France, widowed at 10 after her marriage to Richard II, was remarried at 15 to Charles of Orléans, bearing a child at 19, a grueling path that endangered her health. The expectation to produce heirs, tied to the vows themselves, added pressure that could break even the strongest spirits. Rebellion against these forced vows was rare but telling. Joan of Kent's secret marriage shows a desperate grasp for agency, but most faced insurmountable odds. Ingeborg's refusal to accept annulment led to years of imprisonment, her defiance a lonely stand against a system that valued her vows over her humanity. Others, like Margaret Stuart, sent to France at 11, had no such option, their vows sealing their exile and despair. Chroniclers occasionally noted a bride's melancholy or a groom's reluctance, but the focus remained on political outcomes, not personal suffering. The aftermath of these forced unions could reshape kingdoms. Ingeborg's rejection sparked a diplomatic crisis, with Denmark and the papacy clashing with France, while Isabella's marriage to Richard II, though peaceful, set the stage for England's unrest when Richard was deposed. The vows, spoken under duress, often sowed seeds of future conflict, as resentful spouses or their families sought revenge or annulment. For the young royals at the altar, the wedding day was a moment of dread. Surrounded by watchful nobles, their vows were a public surrender to a life they didn't choose. The psychological scars, fear, isolation, resentment, lingered long after the ceremony, shaping their reigns or their resistance. As we move to the next segment on violence and massacres at these weddings, consider this. If the vows were chains, the celebrations that followed could turn into bloodbaths, where joy was drowned in screams. Medieval royal weddings were meant to be joyous unions, with feasts, music, and dancing under gilded banners. But for some, the celebration turned into a nightmare of bloodshed and betrayal. Far from the romantic tales of modern imagination, these events could erupt into violence, with rivalries or religious tensions igniting chaos that left banquet halls soaked in blood. Some weddings became infamous for massacres, where guests were slaughtered, and what began as a toast to peace ended in screams of terror. These violent outbursts weren't mere accidents, but often calculated moves to eliminate enemies under the guise of festivity. This segment dives into the horrifying reality of violence and massacres at medieval royal weddings, exploring the triggers, the devastating outcomes, and historical examples that reveal how these celebrations became killing fields, making them gatherings you'd flee rather than attend. Royal weddings, by their nature, brought together volatile mixes of rival factions, religious groups, and political enemies, all under the thin veneer of unity. The high stakes of these marriages, forging alliances or ending wars, meant that tensions simmered beneath the surface. A single insult, a disputed toast, or a hidden agenda could spark violence, transforming a celebration into a battlefield. The crowded halls, filled with armed nobles and their retinues, were powder kegs waiting for a spark. Unlike modern weddings, where disputes might lead to a shouting match, medieval ones could end in drawn swords, with entire retinues clashing in the name of honor or power. The presence of alcohol flowing freely at feasts only fueled the potential for chaos, as did the era's lack of centralized authority to enforce peace. The most infamous example is the 1572 wedding of Margaret of Valois to Henry of Navarre, a union meant to ease tensions between Catholics and Huguenots in France during the wars of religion. The ceremony, held in Paris at Notre Dame, was a grand affair, attended by thousands of nobles from both sides. Yet, just days later, on August 24th, the celebration gave way to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, one of the bloodiest episodes in French history. Catholic factions, led by the Guise family and backed by Catherine de' Medici, Margaret's mother, orchestrated a slaughter of Huguenot guests, with estimates of deaths ranging from 5,000 to 30,000 across France. The wedding, intended to symbolize reconciliation, became a trap, with Huguenot leaders like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny cut down in the streets. Margaret herself, caught between her Catholic family and Protestant husband, later wrote of the horror, describing how the joyous bells turned to cries of murder. This massacre, sparked by the wedding's volatile gathering, reshaped France's religious and political landscape, deepening divisions for decades. Violence at weddings wasn't always on such a grand scale, but could still be devastating. The 1268 wedding of Eric II of Norway to Margaret of Scotland, meant to strengthen ties between the two kingdoms, saw tensions boil over during the feast. Scottish and Norwegian nobles, already wary of each other due to territorial disputes, clashed over matters of precedence and honour. Chroniclers like the Orkneyinga saga report that a drunken brawl nearly escalated into a full-scale melee, with swords drawn before cooler heads prevailed. The incident, though contained, highlighted how weddings could become flashpoints for long-simmering grudges, with armed retinues ready to turn festivity into bloodshed. The triggers for such violence were often rooted in the political motives behind the marriage. Weddings that sealed uneasy alliances, like those between rival kingdoms or factions, invited sabotage from those who felt threatened by the new power dynamic. The 1290 betrothal celebration of Margaret, Maid of Norway, to the future Edward II of England, though not a formal wedding, was meant to unite Scotland and England. The event, held in diplomatic talks, saw English nobles provoke Scottish counterparts, leading to heated exchanges that nearly derailed the agreement. Margaret's death shortly after, at 7, prevented further violence, but the episode showed how weddings could ignite conflicts that outlasted the ceremony. The mechanics of these violent outbursts were chillingly effective. Weddings provided cover for premeditated attacks, as large gatherings made it easy to conceal weapons or coordinate ambushes. Retinues, often numbering dozens or hundreds, arrived armed, ostensibly for protection, but ready to strike if ordered. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began with targeted assassinations of Huguenot leaders, orchestrated during the wedding's aftermath, as Catholic forces used the presence of their enemies in Paris to strike. Smaller-scale violence, like at the 1215 wedding of John of England's daughter Joan to Hugh X of Lusignan, saw rival French nobles instigate fights to disrupt the alliance, with chroniclers noting injuries among attendants. The chaos of feasts, with servants, musicians, and guests mingling, allowed attackers to blend in, striking before anyone could react. The psychological impact on attendees was profound. Guests at royal weddings, aware of the risks, arrived in a state of heightened alertness, their hands never far from their daggers. The 1396 wedding of Richard II to Isabella of France, a 7-year-old bride, saw English and French nobles eyeing each other warily, knowing that past weddings had ended in violence. Chronicler Jean Froissart described the unease at the banquet, with guests refusing to let their guards down. Even the newlyweds weren't safe. Young royals, often central to the marriage's purpose, were vulnerable to attacks meant to destabilize the union. The 1180 wedding of Agnes of France, aged 8, to Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, was overshadowed by court tensions that later led to Alexios's murder in 1183, leaving Agnes a widow at 12. The Church, meant to sanctify these unions, often failed to prevent violence. Bishops and clergy, present to bless the marriage, were sometimes complicit in the underlying tensions, as their own political agendas aligned with noble factions. During the 1572 Valois-Navarre wedding, Catholic clergy, including the Archbishop of Paris, were accused of tacitly supporting the massacre, turning a blind eye to the slaughter of Protestant guests. This complicity deepened the sense of betrayal, as the Church's sacred role offered no protection against the bloodshed that followed. The physical toll of these violent weddings was staggering. Beyond immediate deaths, injuries from brawls or ambushes could leave survivors scarred or maimed. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre saw entire families wiped out, with bodies littering Paris streets, a grim testament to the wedding's failure to unite. Even smaller incidents, like the near riot at the 1268 Norwegian-Scottish wedding, left wounds that fueled ongoing feuds. The pipe rolls of Henry III, documenting expenses for guards at his sister's wedding, suggest the constant fear of violence, with monarchs spending heavily to prevent chaos. The aftermath of these violent weddings reshaped history. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre not only decimated the Huguenot leadership, but also prolonged France's religious wars, with Henry of Navarre's survival ironically paving his path to the throne as Henry IV. The 1215 Lusignan wedding, marred by noble skirmishes, weakened John of England's hold on his French territories, contributing to his loss of Normandy. These events show how a wedding's violence could ripple outward, altering the fate of kingdoms. For those attending, a royal wedding was a gamble with life and limb. Guests arrived knowing that a feast could turn fatal, their retinues ready to defend or attack. The psychological strain was relentless, as every smile hid a potential threat, and every clink of goblets could signal danger. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris noted the shadow of fear at such events, where celebration was a thin mask for survival. Young royals like Margaret of Valois or Agnes of France faced the added burden of being pawns in these violent games, their weddings marking the start of lives defined by trauma. In essence, the violence and massacres at medieval royal weddings turned moments of joy into scenes of horror. The banquet halls, meant for celebration, became arenas where swords replaced toasts and unity gave way to slaughter. As we move to the next segment on cursed marriages and tragic outcomes, consider this. If the celebration was a bloodbath, the marriage itself could be a curse, dooming its participants to lives of grief and betrayal. Medieval royal weddings were often hailed as triumphs of diplomacy, uniting kingdoms with golden rings and solemn vows. But beneath the pomp and pageantry, many of these unions seemed cursed, leading to heartbreak, betrayal, or untimely death. Far from fairy tale romances, these marriages, forged for power, not love, could unravel into tragedies that reshaped dynasties and left the newlyweds in misery. Whether through assassination, political fallout, or personal despair, the wedding day often marked the start of a doomed path for brides and grooms, especially the young. This segment explores the chilling phenomenon of cursed marriages, delving into the causes, the devastating consequences, and historical examples that reveal how these royal unions turned into harbingers of doom, making them weddings you'd dread to witness. In the medieval world, royal marriages were high-stakes gambles, binding kingdoms through delicate alliances that could collapse under the weight of ambition or treachery. A cursed marriage wasn't necessarily supernatural, but one where the union's promise of stability led instead to chaos, death, or ruin. These tragedies stemmed from political pressures, mismatched partners, or the vulnerabilities of young royals thrust into roles they couldn't handle. The wedding day, meant to herald prosperity, often planted seeds of disaster as rival factions, personal betrayals, or unforeseen events turned joy into sorrow. For the bride and groom, especially children, the vows they spoke could bind them to a life of danger, isolation, or grief, their fates sealed by forces beyond their control. One of the most heart-wrenching examples is the 1180 marriage of 8-year-old Agnes of France to Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, aged 10. The union, meant to strengthen ties between France and Byzantium, was a diplomatic triumph celebrated with lavish feasts in Constantinople. Yet, the marriage quickly turned tragic. In 1183, Alexios was overthrown and strangled by his cousin Andronikos I, who then married the widowed Agnes, now 12, in a shocking twist. Agnes, a child bride far from home, was left to navigate a treacherous court, her wedding vows chaining her to a murderer. Chroniclers like Nikitas Choniats described her as a pawn in Byzantine politics, her youth exploited until she faded from records, her life a testament to the curse of such unions. Another cursed union was the 1308 marriage of Isabella of France to Edward II of England, intended to secure peace between England and France. The wedding, held in Boulogne, was a spectacle of unity, but it quickly unravelled. Edward's favouritism toward his courtier, Piers Gaveston, sparked tensions, alienating Isabella and her French kin. By her late teens, Isabella faced a crumbling marriage, political isolation, and eventual rebellion against her husband, leading to his deposition and murder in 1327. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart noted the discord that followed the wedding, with Isabella's humiliation fueling a tragic chain of events that destabilized England. The marriage, meant to bring peace, became a curse that ended in bloodshed and betrayal. The causes of these cursed marriages were deeply rooted in their political purpose. Royal weddings were often rushed to seal fragile alliances, leaving little room for compatibility or consent. Young royals like Agnes or Isabella were particularly vulnerable, their age making them pawns in adult schemes. The pressure to produce heirs added further strain, as early childbirth posed lethal risks to young brides. Margaret of Anjou married at 15 to Henry VI of England in 1445, faced a cursed union marked by her husband's mental instability and the Wars of the Roses. Her difficult childbirth at 23, producing a single heir, weakened her health and fueled court rumours of her frailty, turning her marriage into a battleground. Betrayal often followed the wedding vows, amplifying the curse. Spouses could become enemies, as seen in the 1193 marriage of Ingeborg of Denmark to Philip II of France. Philip's immediate rejection of Ingeborg, claiming non-consummation, led to her imprisonment for years, her wedding vows a trap that bound her to a hostile court. Her letters to the Pope reveal a woman broken by betrayal, her marriage a curse that offered no escape. Similarly, the 1285 marriage of Alexander III of Scotland to Yolande of Dreux, meant to secure an heir, ended in tragedy when Alexander died a year later, plunging Scotland into a succession crisis. The wedding, already tainted by poisoning rumours, became a cursed prelude to Scotland's turmoil. The psychological toll on the newlyweds was immense. Young brides and grooms, often separated from family and sent to foreign courts, faced isolation and fear. Anna of Kiev, married to Henry VI of France in 1051, left her Russ's homeland forever, her wedding marking the start of a lonely life in a strange land. Chroniclers noted her melancholy, a glimpse of the emotional strain of a marriage that, while not violent, felt cursed by its isolation. For grooms like Louis VIII, wed at 12 to Blanche of Castile in 1200, the pressure to uphold the Treaty of Le Goulet added a burden that overshadowed their youth. The physical dangers were equally grim. Early childbirth, a common expectation after royal weddings, endangered young brides. Joan of Navarre, married at 12 to Philip IV of France in 1284, faced multiple pregnancies that led to her death in 1305 at 22. The risk of assassination also loomed, as seen with Alexios II, whose 1180 wedding to Agnes led to his murder 3 years later. These tragedies weren't mere bad luck, but the fallout of marriages forged in haste, with little regard for the human cost. The Church, tasked with sanctifying these unions, often exacerbated their cursed nature. Papal dispensations for consanguineous marriages, like that of Isabella and Edward II, kept power within elite circles but increased health risks for offspring, adding to the sense of doom. Bishops, present to bless the vows, ignored the personal toll, as seen in Ingeborg's case, where ecclesiastical support for Philip's annulment bid prolonged her suffering. The Church's focus on political stability over human welfare turned sacred ceremonies into cursed contracts. The political fallout of these marriages could reshape kingdoms. The 1308 Isabella-Edward II union, initially a diplomatic success, led to civil war and Edward's deposition, with Isabella's rebellion against her husband marking a tragic end. The 1445 marriage of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI, meant to secure peace, fueled the Wars of the Roses, with Margaret's leadership in the conflict born from a marriage that cursed her with an unstable throne. Even successful unions, like that of Blanche and Louis VIII, carried a curse of distrust, as their wedding sparked rumours that poisoned Anglo-French relations. For attendees, these weddings were grim spectacles. Guests, aware of the potential for disaster, watched the newlyweds with pity or calculation, knowing the union could unravel into chaos. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris described the heavy air at such events, where joy was tempered by fear of what might follow. The pipe. Rolls of Edward Roy record payments for extra guards at his daughter's weddings, a sign that even the hosts anticipated trouble. Young royals like 7-year-old Isabella of France in 1396 stood at the altar as symbols of hope, yet their vows often marked the start of a cursed life in a foreign court. The legacy of these cursed marriages was a trail of broken lives and kingdoms. Agnes of France, widowed and remarried to her husband's killer, lived a life defined by trauma. Isabella of France, once a celebrated bride, became a rebel queen, her marriage a catalyst for England's unrest. The psychological scars, fear, betrayal, isolation, lingered long after the wedding bells faded, shaping the reigns or rebellions of those who survived. These unions, meant to build empires, often tore them apart, leaving a legacy of tragedy that echoed through history. As we move to the final segment on exploited brides and grooms as pawns, consider this. If a cursed marriage was a tragedy waiting to unfold, the young royals at its heart were pawns in a game they could never win, their lives sacrificed to the altar of power. Medieval royal weddings were grand spectacles, with golden crowns and velvet robes masking a grim truth. The brides and grooms, often mere children, were pawns in a ruthless game of power. These young royals, some too young to understand the vows they spoke, were thrust into marriages to secure alliances, end wars, or claim territories, their personal desires irrelevant. Stripped of agency, they faced isolation, betrayal, or lifelong obligation, their wedding days marking the start of lives dictated by politics rather than love. This final segment explores the exploitation of young brides and grooms as diplomatic tools, the emotional and physical toll of their roles, the political machinations behind their unions, and historical examples that reveal how these weddings turned childhood dreams into dynastic duties, making them ceremonies you'd never want to witness. In the medieval world, royal children were raised knowing their marriages would serve the crown, not their hearts. Betrothals could be arranged in infancy, with weddings formalized as young as 7 or 8, exploiting their youth to cement alliances before they could resist. These young pawns were often sent to foreign courts, far from family, to live as virtual hostages, ensuring their parents' compliance. The Church, endorsing these unions with minimum marriage ages of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, often issued dispensations for earlier betrothals, prioritizing political stability over the children's well-being. For these young royals, the wedding day was not a celebration, but a transaction, their vows sealing a life of duty and sacrifice. A poignant example is the 1200 marriage of 12-year-old Blanche of Castile to Louis VIII of France, also 12, sealed by the Treaty of Le Goulet to secure peace between England and France. Blanche, sent from Castile to a foreign court, was a diplomatic pawn under her grandmother Eleanor of Aquitaine's orchestration. Chroniclers like Roger of Wendover noted her isolation as she navigated a French court rife with hostility toward her English ties. Her wedding, meant to unite kingdoms, marked the start of a life where her every action was scrutinized, her youth exploited to uphold a fragile truce. Blanche's strength as a future regent came at the cost of a childhood lost to political maneuvering. Another tragic case is the 1396 wedding of 7-year-old Isabella of France to Richard II of England, aged 29. The marriage, held in Calais, was a diplomatic move to end hostilities in the 100 Years' War. Isabella, barely able to comprehend her vows, was sent to England as a symbol of peace, her childhood sacrificed to politics. Jean Froissart's chronicles describe her as a child bride surrounded by strangers, her innocence a stark contrast to the cynical motives of the union. When Richard was deposed 3 years later, Isabella, widowed at 10, was remarried. At 15, her life shaped by the exploitation that began with her wedding day. The exploitation of young royals was deliberate and systematic. Parents and guardians groomed children for their roles, using tutors to instill obedience and duty. Refusal was unthinkable, as it could unravel treaties or spark wars. The 1180 marriage of 8-year-old Agnes of France to Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, aged 10, was a stark example. Sent to Constantinople, Agnes was a pawn in her father Louis VII's bid to strengthen ties with Byzantium. When Alexios was murdered in 1183, Agnes, widowed at 12, was forced to marry his killer, Andronikos III, her youth exploited again in a new political scheme. Her wedding, meant to forge alliances, became a chain binding her to trauma. The emotional toll on these young pawns was profound. Sent to foreign courts, they faced cultural alienation and loneliness, often without family support. Margaret Stuart, betrothed at 11 to the future Louis XV of France in 1436, was sent to a French court where she languished, dying at 20 from the strain of isolation. Chroniclers noted her melancholy, a glimpse into the despair of a child bride used as a diplomatic tool. Boys, too, suffered. Edward of Westminster, son of Margaret of Anjou, was betrothed at 5 in 1458 to secure French support, his childhood overshadowed by the Wars of the Roses. These children, robbed of agency, internalized their roles as pawns, their emotions buried under the weight of duty. Physical risks were equally severe. Young brides faced pressure to consummate marriages early, despite church rules delaying it until puberty, leading to health complications. Joan of Navarre, married at 12 to Philip IV of France in 1284, endured multiple pregnancies that led to her death at 22 in 1305. Young grooms like Louis VIII faced the strain of early political responsibilities, with Louis leading armies by his teens to uphold his marriage's diplomatic goals. The constant threat of betrayal or assassination, as seen with Alexios II, added to their vulnerability. The political motives behind these marriages were relentless. Kings like Edward IV of England used their daughters, Eleanor, Joan, and Margaret, to secure borderlands or neutralize rivals, with Eleanor's marriage at 14 to Alfonso III of Aragon tying her to a husband's ransom negotiations. These unions often served as leverage, with young royals sent as hostages to ensure compliance. The 1229 Treaty of Paris saw Raymond VII of Toulouse's son held as a guarantee, his betrothal a tool to enforce peace. The Church facilitated this exploitation, granting dispensations for consanguineous marriages that kept power within elite circles but ignored the human cost. Resistance was rare and costly. Joan of Kent, betrothed young but secretly marrying Thomas Holland at 12 in 1340, defied her guardians. but papal intervention was needed to legitimize her choice. Most, like Ingeborg of Denmark, married at 18 to Philip II in 1193, had no such option. Her rejection and imprisonment after the wedding show the consequences of being a pawn, her vows binding her to a life of captivity. Chroniclers rarely recorded the emotional toll, but glimpses like Margaret Stuart's Languishing reveal the despair of exploited royals. The aftermath of these marriages could destabilize kingdoms. Blanche's 1200 marriage to Louis VIII, while producing heirs, sowed distrust that fueled Anglo-French conflicts. Isabella's 1396 marriage to Richard II, meant to secure peace, ended, with his deposition leaving her a widowed child navigating a new marriage. These unions, designed to strengthen dynasties, often sparked crises, as exploited royals became focal points for rebellion or revenge. For attendees, these weddings were somber affairs. Guests, aware of the young couple's plight, watched with pity or calculation, knowing the marriage could unravel into chaos. The pipe rolls of Henry III note payments for keepers at his sister's wedding, a sign that even hosts feared unrest. Matthew Paris described the heavy air at such events, where celebration masked sorrow for the pawns at the altar. In conclusion, the exploitation of young brides and grooms turned medieval royal weddings into grim transactions. Their youth was a tool for kings and queens, their vows a sentence to lives of duty and danger. These ceremonies, far from joyous, were a stark reminder that in the Game of Thrones, children were the most vulnerable pieces, their dreams sacrificed for power. This series has peeled back the veil on royal weddings, revealing a world of poison, betrayal, and tragedy where love was a stranger, and survival was the only victory.